The prison stood in the western sector of Berlin, surrounded by quiet streets and ordinary apartment buildings. From the outside, it looked almost forgotten, a heavy block of red brick and iron that seemed to belong to another century. But behind its walls existed one of the strangest remnants of the Second World War, a prison designed for 7 men who had once stood at the center of one of the most destructive regimes in history. This was Spandau Prison. After the war ended, the Allied powers faced a problem that had never existed before. The leaders of Nazi Germany had been captured, tried in the Nuremberg trials, and sentenced for crimes that had shocked the world. Some were condemned to death, others received long prison sentences. 7 of them were sent here, to a prison in Berlin that would become one of the most unusual institutions of the Cold War. Spandau had originally been built decades earlier, in the 19th century, long before the Nazi era. It had thick walls, narrow corridors, and tall watchtowers rising above the courtyard. The design was simple and severe. Rows of cells lined long hallways, each one identical. Each one built to isolate a prisoner from the outside world. The structure was capable of holding hundreds of inmates. But after the Nuremberg verdicts, the prison was transformed into something completely different. It would now hold only 7. The prisoners who arrived here were not ordinary criminals. They had once been among the most powerful figures in the Third Reich, men who had commanded armies, written laws, organized propaganda, and helped shape the machinery of the Nazi state. Their names were known around the world, and their trials had been broadcast across newspapers and radio. The Allies feared that if they were imprisoned together without strict control, the prison itself could become a symbol. It might turn into a place of political influence, or even a shrine for extremists who still believed in the ideology that had led Europe into catastrophe. So the prison was placed under an unusual system of control. Instead of belonging to a single country, Spandau would be administered jointly by the 4 Allied powers that occupied Berlin after the war: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union. Every month, authority over the prison would rotate. One month, the guards would answer to American command, the next month, the British, then the French, then the Soviets. After that, the cycle would begin again. This system was meant to ensure balance. None of the powers would gain full control over the prisoners. Decisions would be shared, recorded, and supervised by representatives from all 4 nations. But it also created an atmosphere unlike any other prison on Earth. The routines changed depending on which nation was in charge. The tone of the guards changed. The discipline could become stricter or more relaxed. Even small privileges, such as access to books, letters, or time in the garden, could vary depending on who held authority that month. Inside the walls of Spandau, the Cold War was already beginning to take shape. The 7 prisoners were assigned numbers instead of names. They lived in separate cells along the same corridor, and strict rules limited how often they could communicate with one another. Each day followed a rigid schedule. They woke early. They ate simple meals prepared by prison staff. They were allowed to walk in the courtyard under supervision, and they spent long hours alone inside their cells. For men who had once commanded millions of people, the silence of Spandau must have been overwhelming. The prison itself operated on a scale that seemed almost absurd for the number of inmates it held. Dozens of guards were required to maintain the security system. Administrative staff documented every movement, every meal, every letter that entered or left the facility. Reports were written constantly and shared among the 4 occupying powers. Everything was recorded, nothing was left to chance. But the most unusual part of Spandau was not the prisoners who entered it. It was what happened to them over time. Some of the men sentenced at Nuremberg were elderly or in poor health. Years of imprisonment took their toll quickly. Illness began to spread among the inmates, and several of them were eventually released early due to medical conditions. Others simply did not survive long enough to serve the full length of their sentences. One by one, the number of prisoners inside Spandau began to shrink. Cells that had once been occupied fell silent. Corridors that had once held 7 men now held 5, then 4, then 3. The structure of the prison, built for hundreds and staffed by dozens of guards, slowly began to feel emptier with each passing year. Yet the system that governed it remained unchanged. The guard rotations continued. The administrative reports continued. The 4 nations still met regularly to discuss the management of a prison whose population was steadily disappearing. By the 1960s, the situation had become strange, even by Cold War standards. Only a handful of prisoners remained. The vast corridors of Spandau echoed with footsteps that belonged mostly to guards rather than inmates. Entire cell blocks were locked and unused. The garden courtyard, once meant for several prisoners to exercise under supervision, was now often occupied by only 1 or 2 men at a time. The prison was becoming a monument to something that had already passed. But the strangest chapter in its history had not yet begun, because eventually all but one of the prisoners would leave. Some would be released, some would die. And the enormous prison that had once held 7 men would remain open for a single inmate. A prison staffed by dozens of guards. A prison administered by 4 world powers. A prison that existed entirely for one man who would become known as the last prisoner of Spandau, and his name was Rudolf Hess. By the time he arrived at Spandau Prison, Rudolf Hess was already one of the most unusual figures to emerge from the ruins of the Third Reich. Unlike many of the other men sentenced at the Nuremberg trials, Hess had not been captured at the end of the war. He had been in Allied custody long before Germany surrendered. His story had begun years earlier, with a decision that still puzzles historians to this day. In the early years of Nazi rule, Rudolf Hess had been one of Adolf Hitler's most loyal followers. He joined the Nazi movement when it was still small and radical, long before it came to power. He fought alongside Hitler politically and ideologically, becoming part of the inner circle that helped shape the future of the regime. When Hitler rose to power in Germany, Hess rose with him. He was given the title Deputy Führer, one of the highest positions in the Nazi state. His office handled party matters, internal directives, and the structure of the growing Nazi organization. In many ways, Hess functioned as a gatekeeper to Hitler himself. Documents passed through him. Party leaders answered to him. His authority extended across the entire political structure of the Third Reich. Yet even during those years, Hess was known as an unusual figure inside the Nazi leadership. He was deeply ideological and almost fanatically loyal to Hitler, but he lacked the political ruthlessness that characterized many of the other leaders around him. While figures like Himmler, Goering and Goebbels built vast systems of power, Hess remained more withdrawn, more focused on ideology than strategy. He was fascinated by mysticism, astrology, and strange theories about destiny and history. Some within the Nazi leadership saw him as devoted but eccentric. Others quietly considered him unstable. Still, his loyalty to Hitler never seemed to waver. Then, in the spring of 1941, something extraordinary happened. Without informing most of the Nazi leadership, Hess prepared for a secret mission that would change the course of his life forever. On the evening of May 10, 1941, he climbed into a Messerschmitt fighter aircraft and took off from Germany alone. His destination was Britain. At the time, the Second World War was already raging across Europe. Germany had conquered large parts of the continent, and Britain stood as one of its last major opponents in the West. Bombing raids were striking British cities. Military conflict seemed inevitable for years to come. But Hess believed something different was possible. He believed he could negotiate peace. Flying alone across the North Sea, he navigated towards Scotland, carrying with him the idea that Britain and Germany did not need to continue the war. According to his own later statements, he believed that certain British political figures might be willing to reach an agreement that would end hostilities between the two nations. The flight itself was incredibly dangerous. Hess was not an experienced long-distance pilot, and he was flying without official support from the German government. By the time he reached British airspace, he was running low on fuel. He eventually bailed out of the aircraft over the Scottish countryside. Local farmers discovered him soon after he landed. Injured and disoriented, he identified himself under a false name at first. But it did not take long for British authorities to realize who they had captured. The Deputy Führer of Nazi Germany had just parachuted into Britain. The event stunned both sides of the war. In London, the British government treated the situation with extreme caution. Hess was interrogated extensively, but his proposals for peace negotiations were quickly dismissed. There was no evidence that he had official authority from Hitler to negotiate anything. In Berlin, the reaction was immediate and furious. Hitler publicly declared that Hess had lost his mind. The Nazi leadership announced that he had acted completely on his own and no longer represented the German government. His position within the party was abolished almost overnight. From that moment on, Rudolf Hess became something strange even within the history of the war. A senior Nazi leader who had essentially removed himself from the regime long before its defeat. For the remainder of the war, the British kept him imprisoned. He spent years in isolation, questioned repeatedly about the inner workings of the Nazi leadership and the circumstances of his flight. Yet the mystery surrounding his motivations never fully disappeared. Some believed he had truly acted alone out of ideological conviction. Others suspected that he had hoped to position himself as a secret negotiator between two powers. No clear answer ever emerged. When the war ended and the Nuremberg trials began, Hess was transferred to Germany to stand trial alongside the other surviving leaders of the Nazi regime. Inside the courtroom, he behaved in ways that only deepened the mystery around him. At times, he appeared calm and attentive. At other moments, he claimed to suffer from severe memory loss, insisting that he could not remember large portions of his past. Some observers believed the amnesia was genuine. Others suspected it was an attempt to avoid responsibility for his actions. During one dramatic moment in the trial, Hess suddenly announced that his memory had returned, declaring that he had been pretending to forget everything as a tactic. The courtroom fell silent. The judges struggled to determine what was genuine and what was performance. Despite the confusion surrounding his mental state, the verdict eventually came. Hess was found guilty of crimes against peace and conspiracy related to the Nazi war effort, but he avoided the death sentence that several other defendants received. Instead, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. In 1947, Rudolf Hess was transferred to Spandau Prison in Berlin, along with the other convicted leaders who had received prison sentences. Inside the prison system, he was given a simple designation, Prisoner Number 7. At the time, no one could have imagined that decades later, that number would belong to the only prisoner left alive inside the walls of Spandau. By the middle of the 1960s, Spandau Prison had begun to transform into something that no one had originally planned. When the 7 prisoners first arrived after the Nuremberg trials, the prison had been a controlled but still functioning institution. Guards monitored several inmates. Daily routines involved multiple prisoners walking the courtyard, working in small areas of the prison, and occasionally encountering one another under supervision. But time slowly changed everything. The first change came through illness and age. Many of the men sentenced at Nuremberg were already older by the time they entered Spandau. Years of imprisonment, combined with declining health, began to take their toll. One by one, the prisoners began to disappear. Some died behind the walls of the prison. Others were eventually released for humanitarian reasons when doctors determined that their health had deteriorated beyond recovery. Each release was debated by the 4 Allied powers, and each decision required agreement among governments that no longer trusted one another, because by this time the world had already entered the Cold War. The uneasy alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany had fractured. Berlin itself was divided between East and West. American and Soviet soldiers stood only a few streets apart, in a city that had become one of the most dangerous political fault lines on the planet. Yet inside Spandau Prison, the strange system of joint control continued. Every month, authority rotated between the 4 powers: the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Flags changed at the entrance gate. Officers from different nations took over administration. Guard routines shifted slightly depending on which country held command. But the prison itself remained the same: silent, heavy, and increasingly empty. By 1966, the situation had become extraordinary. One by one, the remaining prisoners had either died or been released. Their cells were closed. Their names disappeared from the prison registers. Corridors that had once held multiple inmates were now completely deserted. Only one prisoner remained: Rudolf Hess. From that moment forward, the enormous prison complex existed for a single man. Spandau had been built to hold hundreds of inmates. Entire wings of the building contained rows of empty cells. Watchtowers overlooked a courtyard large enough for dozens of prisoners to exercise at once. But now, the entire system functioned for prisoner number 7 alone. Dozens of guards still worked there. Administrative staff continued writing detailed reports. Representatives from 4 world powers still met regularly to discuss the management of the prison, all for one elderly inmate. The scale of the operation began to attract attention from journalists and diplomats. Some described Spandau as the loneliest prison on earth. Others called it the most expensive prison ever maintained for a single person. Inside the walls, Hess followed a routine that changed very little from day to day. He lived in a small cell that contained only the basic necessities: a bed, a table, a chair, and a few personal items. The room was simple and carefully monitored. Guards checked on him constantly, and all communication was strictly controlled. Each morning he woke early. Meals were delivered according to a strict schedule. He was allowed to read books, write letters, and spend limited time outside in the prison garden. Doctors regularly examined his health, documenting every physical complaint in official reports. Because Hess was aging rapidly, by the 1970s he was already an old man, far removed from the figure who had once stood beside Hitler during the early years of the Nazi regime. His movements became slower, his eyesight weakened. Doctors recorded numerous medical conditions associated with age. Yet the prison system around him remained unchanged. the four Allied powers still debated his future. The Western governments, particularly Britain and the United States, gradually began to question whether it made sense to keep a man in his 80s imprisoned under such extreme conditions. Some officials argued that his continued confinement no longer served any real purpose. But one government disagreed: the Soviet Union. For Moscow, Hess represented more than just an aging prisoner. He was a symbol, a living reminder of the crimes committed by the Nazi regime against millions of Soviet citizens during the war. From the Soviet perspective, releasing him early would send the wrong message. The sentence had been life imprisonment, and life imprisonment meant exactly that. Every proposal for his release was blocked. And so the strange routine of Spandau continued, year after year. The prison garden became one of the few places where Hess could move freely under supervision. It was a small, quiet area surrounded by high walls, with narrow walking paths and patches of grass carefully maintained by prison staff. There, the last prisoner of Spandau spent much of his time. He walked slowly along the same paths day after day, watched by guards who sometimes outnumbered the prisoner they were guarding. Conversations between Hess and the guards were limited and carefully monitored, but over the years some of the staff came to know his habits well. He spoke little. Sometimes he appeared withdrawn, almost detached from the world outside the prison walls. At other times he complained about his health or the conditions of his confinement. Letters from family members were censored and delivered only after inspection. Beyond the walls of Spandau, the world continued to change. The Berlin Wall rose and divided the city. Generations grew up who had never experienced the Second World War firsthand. Governments changed, alliances shifted, and new global crises emerged. But inside the prison, time seemed almost frozen. An enormous institution, guarded by 4 nuclear powers, existed for one aging prisoner who walked slowly through the garden each day under the watchful eyes of soldiers from countries that had once fought the war that put him there. And as the decades passed, one question quietly began to circulate among diplomats and historians. What would happen when the last prisoner of Spandau finally died? By the 1980s, the existence of Spandau Prison had become almost surreal. Rudolf Hess was now in his 90s. His body had weakened with age, and medical reports described a man who moved slowly, struggled with chronic illness, and spent most of his time under close observation by doctors and guards. Yet despite his condition, the massive prison complex around him continued to operate exactly as it had for decades. The administration remained the same. The guard rotations continued every month. Reports were still written and exchanged between 4 governments. For many observers outside the prison, the situation seemed almost impossible to justify. Spandau had become a prison for one man. Every day, dozens of guards reported for duty to monitor a single elderly inmate. Entire sections of the prison remained locked and unused, but they were still maintained, cleaned, and inspected as part of the official routine. The courtyard, once meant for multiple prisoners to exercise under supervision, now held only Hess during his daily walks. The system that kept the prison running had originally been created in the aftermath of the Second World War. But by the 1980s, that world no longer existed. Europe had changed. New generations had grown up. Even the political landscape of the Cold War had begun to shift. Still, Spandau remained frozen in time. Within the Western governments, the question of Hess's imprisonment began to surface more frequently. Diplomats and officials quietly debated whether it was still necessary to keep a man of such advanced age confined in a prison designed for war criminals. Some argued that the continued operation of Spandau had become symbolic rather than practical. Others suggested that releasing Hess on humanitarian grounds might close one of the last remaining chapters of the Second World War. But any change required agreement between all four powers, and that was where the discussions always stopped. The Soviet Union remained firmly opposed to releasing him. For Soviet officials, the war against Nazi Germany had not been a distant historical event. It had been a devastating national trauma. Entire cities had been destroyed. Millions of Soviet citizens had died during the conflict. Within that context, Hess was not simply an elderly prisoner. He represented the leadership of a regime responsible for unimaginable destruction. Allowing him to leave prison early, even at the age of 90, would be seen as a betrayal of the sacrifices made during the war. So every proposal for his release was rejected. Inside Spandau, Hess continued to live according to the rigid routines that had defined his life for decades. His daily schedule rarely changed. He woke early each morning and received simple meals prepared by the prison staff. Medical examinations were frequent, and doctors carefully recorded his physical condition. Letters from family members were occasionally delivered after inspection by prison authorities. One of the few places where Hess spent time outside his cell was a small garden area within the prison walls. The garden had once been used by several inmates, but now it belonged almost entirely to him. Guards accompanied him during these walks, keeping their distance but always watching. At the edge of the garden stood a small structure known as the garden house. It was a simple building, almost like a shed, used occasionally as a resting place during Hess's walks. Over the years, it had become a quiet part of the prison grounds, where the aging prisoner could sit briefly before returning to his cell. Most days passed without incident. But outside the walls of Spandau, the world was beginning to change rapidly. The Cold War itself was entering a new phase. Tensions between East and West were slowly shifting as new political leaders emerged, and discussions about reform began to circulate within the Soviet Union. In this changing world, the strange existence of Spandau Prison began to look increasingly outdated. Journalists occasionally wrote about the prison that held only one inmate. Historians referred to it as a relic of another era, a surviving fragment of the war that had ended decades earlier. But despite the growing sense that history was moving forward, nothing changed for the man inside the walls. Rudolf Hess continued his routine. Each day he walked through the garden under guard. Each night he returned to his cell in the silent corridors of a prison built for hundreds, but occupied by only one. And then, in the summer of 1987, something happened inside the garden house that would turn the final chapter of Spandau Prison into one of the most controversial mysteries of the Cold War. On the 17th of August 1987, the routine inside Spandau Prison began like any other day. For decades, the life of Rudolf Hess had followed a schedule so strict that almost nothing ever changed. Guards monitored his movements, doctors examined his health, and every small activity was recorded in official reports. But that afternoon, something happened that would end the strange history of the prison forever. Hess was allowed to spend time in the prison garden, a place he had walked through thousands of times over the years. By this point, he was 93 years old, and his walks were slow and carefully supervised. Guards usually remained nearby, keeping him in sight while maintaining a certain distance. Near the edge of the garden stood the small structure known as the garden house. It was a modest building, almost like a wooden shelter, where Hess sometimes rested during his walks. The structure had existed there for years and was considered a quiet corner of the prison grounds. On that afternoon, Hess entered the garden house alone. According to the official account, a short time later, a guard approached the building and found something disturbing inside. Rudolf Hess was sitting on the floor, unconscious. Around his neck was an electrical cable that had been tied to a window handle inside the building. The guards reacted immediately. Medical staff were called, and attempts were made to revive him. An ambulance transported him to a nearby British military hospital in West Berlin, but it was too late. Rudolf Hess was pronounced dead shortly afterward. The official explanation was simple: suicide. According to the investigation conducted at the time, Hess had used the electrical cord to hang himself inside the garden house. The report concluded that the elderly prisoner had taken his own life after decades of confinement. But almost immediately, questions began to appear. The circumstances surrounding his death seemed strange to many observers. Hess was 93 years old and physically frail. Some doctors had described him as weak and partially disabled. Critics of the official version argued that it would have been extremely difficult for him to carry out such an act alone. Others pointed to the details of the cable itself, claiming that the length and position made the explanation unclear. The controversy grew when members of Hess's family publicly rejected the suicide verdict. They insisted that the former prisoner had been murdered and demanded further investigation into the circumstances of his death. Rumors spread quickly. Some theories suggested that Hess had been killed to prevent him from revealing secrets about his mysterious flight to Britain decades earlier. Others claimed that intelligence agencies feared what he might say if he were eventually released. None of these theories were ever proven. Official investigations conducted by British authorities concluded that the evidence supported the suicide ruling. The case was closed, and no criminal charges were ever filed. Yet the debate never fully disappeared. Even today, historians still argue about what truly happened inside the garden house that afternoon. But one thing happened immediately after his death that added another strange layer to the story. Within weeks, the prison itself was destroyed. The four Allied powers agreed that Spandau Prison should be demolished completely. Their concern was that the site might become a gathering place for neo-Nazi groups or extremists who might try to turn it into a shrine. So the decision was made to erase it. Bulldozers moved in, and the heavy walls that had once held the prisoners of Nuremberg were torn down piece by piece. Guard towers were dismantled, cell blocks were demolished. The prison that had existed for more than a century disappeared within a short time. Today, there is almost nothing left to mark where Spandau Prison once stood. On the site where the prison used to rise above the streets of Berlin, there is now an ordinary commercial area. Shops and parking lots occupy the ground where the last prisoner once walked slowly through the garden under armed guard. The strange institution that had once been guarded by four world powers simply vanished. But the story of its final inmate never completely faded. Rudolf Hess entered Spandau as one of several convicted leaders of Nazi Germany. He remained there longer than anyone else, and when he died, the prison itself died with him, leaving behind one of the most unusual and controversial chapters of the Cold War. Spandau Prison no longer exists. Its walls were demolished, its towers erased from the Berlin skyline. Even the ground where it once stood was turned into something ordinary, as if the world wanted to forget it. But history has a strange habit of leaving questions behind. A prison built for 7 men that ended with only one. A man who once stood beside Hitler. A flight to Britain that still has no clear explanation. And a death inside a quiet garden house that many still dispute. Was it truly the final act of an old prisoner, or the last secret of the Cold War? Some stories end with answers. This one ended with demolition. And the last prisoner of Spandau took many of those answers with him.